Well, hello everyone. Good to see you all here at Nap Hour, and I'm going to talk about Christopher Columbus, we all remember well from our school time. But before I start, I just want to say that's some Brazilian music from Gilberto Gil, who is a well-known songwriter in Brazil, who in the Lula da Silva government was appointed Minister of Culture, which of course, maybe some of you come from a country where you have that, but it's almost like Bob Dylan being appointed Minister of Culture in the U.S. But he's back from his desk job and back playing. He's about 75 years old, and that's his new album. So keep playing, everyone. And but even Columbus, he was a man of many talents. I don't know musical talents, but I call him the mysterious explorer because from the beginning to the end of his life, there were many questions about who he really was, above all, where he really came from. And so you know the general story of it, but it's in the details that it gets most curious. First of all, his name. We know him in English as Christopher Columbus, and Christopher is actually his first name, which means the bearer of Christ in Greek. But Colon, or Columbus, Colombo, all the variations in the various European languages, it's actually a Greek word which means the member of a community. And he was born on the island of Chios in the Aegean. So some of the historians said that was not really his family name, and nobody really knows where he came from. 1451 is his supposed birth, but again, there's no family heritage. He said he was from Genoa, and Chios was a trading outpost very far away from Genoa on the whole other side of the Mediterranean. But he said he was born of a family who were weavers. But then why did he end up living on an island as a teenager, and he became a sailor? At age 14, he went to sea. And he did not speak Genovese or Ligurian at all. He spoke Catalan and part Portuguese. And so curiously, he was sort of a stranger wherever he went, but of course he then gathered the fleet to go sail and discovered the new world such as it was. Of course, we know that there were many other discoverers, just that he was there for 4 different times and led the age of exploration and the discovery of the new world such as it became. But back before then, the European communities were somewhat isolated. They did not know beyond the Mediterranean and Northern Europe and Central Asia generally, but in earlier times they thought that there must be more land just for the harmonic balance of the world. But they thought there was Asia, Europe, and Africa. They didn't think there was much more out there. This is what they call a T&O philosophical map of the world. Back then, geography and philosophy and theology were all somewhat neatly wrapped up in the speculation that the center of the world was Jerusalem. And so Africa, Europe, and Asia were known with the seas and the rivers flowing from the spiritual center of the world, which was in the Middle East, in Jerusalem. Now, this is speaking of the time when there were the Crusades and a lot of conflict with Islam. This is a medieval representation of the flowing of the rivers being the Nile, the Euphrates, and other waters that would lead to the Mediterranean and then around the world as they knew it. But the extent of the world was not really known. This is a medieval Arabic map of El-Idrisi out of Baghdad, which does show the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and then sort of a vague view of what they would call in Latin the ocean fluvius, which would be the flowing extent of the outward seas that they didn't know where they went. Now, the old canard about the world being flat. Well, most sailors knew it wasn't flat because you can see the ships going over the horizon. And so the extent of that horizon, though, was unknown. And to go out of the gates of Hercules and Gibraltar was considered to be a very risky thing because people would go out and never come back, even though it was even Aristotle who wrote that there was land beyond the gates of Hercules, but it was too dangerous to go out there. That was the big ocean, whereas the Mediterranean, for all its trouble, was a relatively calmer sea. So before Columbus set out, this was the general view from Europe. They knew about Greenland, Iceland, the islands off of Azores, Madeira, Canary, and then as the Portuguese began to explore down the African coast, they went all the way down to the Bight of Guinea and the coast of West Africa. But because there was trade with the Arabs and then the Chinese, it was well known that there was the Far East. And so what drove the European exploration, and Columbus specifically finally, was the closing of the trade routes to the Middle East for the silk, the spices, and other very valuable goods, which were traded via the Levant and Constantinople, and then Venice and Genoa were the middlemen for the rest of Europe. So if you were in Spain or Portugal or England at the time, you paid such a high price for any of those very precious goods. And then when the Ottomans took over Constantinople in 1453, there was a break in the trade, and that was one of the primary reasons why particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish were convinced that they had to go out and find a way to the Spice Islands and to the riches of the Far East on their own. Well, this was not possible until they had better navigation, because previously it was all coastal piloting, following what they call the portolan, or the descriptions of just the winds of the Mediterranean. But as soon as you're out in the Atlantic, they were lost until this invention of the compass. Now, this is a Chinese geomancy compass in my own collection, which is not used for navigation, but it was the Chinese who first annotated the use of a magnetic stone to indicate direction, originally for determining feng shui, geomancy, fortune telling, and then it was put into a gimbaled surface box so that it could roll around at sea with a suspended needle, either on a string originally, then on a little spindle, even floating in the water. And then they were able to then get a very crude direction of magnetic north, south, east, west. They didn't know about variation and deviation at the time, but here's one of the earliest illustrations in Europe of the use of a compass. Now, it came via Arab traders, finally ended up in Amalfi, Italy, and then it was out and developed into the point where Columbus had his own with a compass rose. Now, this is now still standard on our traditional compass, but the points of the star are actually the directions that are corresponded to the winds seasonally in the Mediterranean. And this is said to be Columbus's own compass that's at his museum house in Gran Canaria Island on the Canaries, with at the center the Virgin Mary and Jesus. Well, the other problem was determining your latitude, longitude, for which you had sighting sticks and northern hemisphere stars and such that you could determine your latitude crudely by these instruments, which then were developed with optics into the sextant as we have today, even on this ship, I hear. And this let them go out into the larger ocean, and then they could sight Polaris, the North Star, and then get a rough determination of their latitude. Longitude, though, the east-west measure was done by taking soundings near shore or keeping a watch and a log of your speed and an estimated distance. So that's called deduced reckoning or dead reckoning. It was essential was the measure of time. So this is an old medieval hourglass with sand in it. So this would go for usually 15 minutes or a half an hour, and it would have to be watched so that you turn it over and then you measure how many times that was done, so you get a crude measure of time. But even that is still done today, but with chronometers and the invention of the stable clock. But even today you have what's called a watch, and that comes from watching an hourglass. Similarly, on any ship you keep watch, which means originally you were watching the hourglass. Now you watch the different instruments. But it was not for a couple more centuries when John Harrison in England won the prize to develop the chronometer that gave accurate timekeeping at sea and led to a more better knowledge of how to navigate and determine longitude. Well, at this time, the Europeans were just learning from the rest of the world. First of all, the compass came from China slowly. Then the Arabs developed the astrolabe, which was a sighting instrument with annotations for different planetary and celestial sightings. So this is almost like a large pocket instrument. You could use it to help determine your latitude in particular. So Columbus no doubt had one of these. This was a training that was contemporary at his time in Portugal, where the Henry the Navigator, the second son of Prince João I, established a school in Sagres, Portugal, to try to collect this knowledge and then train navigators and mariners to go out into the great Atlantic, and particularly to go down to Africa and look for new lands and islands, which they, of course, did. Now, this point of land in southern Portugal is no longer occupied, but you can see the large sighting field in stone that was used for, again, training in celestial navigation. Now, we don't know if Columbus actually went to that school, but he had ended up being on a merchant ship that was shipwrecked off of Portugal. Even though he came from Chios in what's now Greece, he ended up washing up on the shores of Lagos, Portugal, and then ended up living in Alfama in Lisbon and worked as a young cartographer. So he took up the study of all of this navigation in Lisbon, which at the time was a very busy port, beginning to send out more and more expeditions. Of course, the Portuguese had already been to the various islands, the Azores, Madeira. We think they had already gone to Newfoundland, and even Columbus worked as a crew on a vessel to go to England and to Iceland. So he was pretty worldly already when he began to propose what he called the project for the Indies. He had listened to various other navigators who said, well, there is more land out there, and we think that that may be the next thing to do, because you see, at that time, the Ottoman Empire took over the Eastern Mediterranean. There was a lot of rivalry between Venice, Genoa, and it was a very dangerous prospect to begin to go to the east by land or by water. And so Columbus went around the Mediterranean. He went back to Genoa, where he actually didn't speak the language. Then he went to the Portuguese. He finally went to Spain to propose that they fund an expedition to test this hypothesis that you can sail west to Asia and to the Indies. And here's his town in Chios at the time. But in the Eastern Mediterranean, they were not interested. They were involved in their local domestic trade. But documents have surfaced out over the years that show that this was sort of a time in history where many people were proposing this. A bit later, Magellan did the same thing. He went around to the different merchant houses and courts and tried to propose that they have this kind of expeditions. But it was really the Portuguese who developed the navigational training and then built the caravels, which curiously took on the Arabic Latin rig, which is what we have now on modern sailboats, which is much better for sailing to wind. And then they adapted that with the square rig, and then they had a better ship to go out into the far unknown. So this, you can imagine Columbus as a dreamy young sailor. At one point he wrote down that the sea will grant each man new hope, and his sleep brings him dreams of home. Just like on this ship. Well, anyway, he then became an advocate with his brother Bartholomew to mount an expedition. And they went and they tried to convince some of the clerics in Portugal and Spain that they should feel that this is also a mission to extend Christianity. Of course, at this time, the Portuguese and the Spanish had just finished kicking the Moors and all the Muslims out of the peninsula, and they were already, let's say, on the expansion. The Portuguese took the port of Quetta, and then they had a base in Morocco at the time. They felt, well, Africa is waiting for Christianity and waiting for the explorers, and similarly other lands that had yet been found. But it was not until Columbus and his brother Bartholomew went to the court of Ferdinand and Isabella that they got the full audience with the means to support such a mission. So that previous manuscript was sort of of the time. This is a later painting of Ferdinand and Isabella, who married the houses of Leon and Castilla to make modern Spain. And this was a time of a lot of intrigue. For instance, Isabella's brother was supposed to be king of Castile, but he died mysteriously. Some people think he was poisoned by his sister. And then she married the counterpart in Leon, and then together they sent their armies to conquer Granada and make Spain again the full country that it became. But they took the advice of Columbus. But at the same time, they were running the Inquisition, and they were driving out all of the remnant communities of the Moors, and also they drove out all the Jews. And so this was the time of great cruelty in Spain in the righteous time of the Inquisition. So here's an illustration later of Columbus before a council in the University of Salamanca, Spain, trying to convince them by showing them some of the cartography that there were other places even beyond the islands they know. So this is an earlier map of Pisano that shows, that's Gibraltar right there. And so then you have the Azores over here, and you have Madeira right there, and the Canary Islands here, and the coast of Africa. But this is the most curious island. It's called the Isla de Antilla, which was said to be the easternmost island of Asia. And curiously, in this map, 1424, if you turn it aside, what you find is an island in that illustration, which looks almost exactly like the island of Puerto Rico with Vieques over here, but it has ports of look like San Juan and Ponce and the rest of them. So the question is, who got there first to know about that? It might have been Portuguese sailors. It could have been other adventurers at another time. But this led to a lot of speculations how far Asia was from Western Europe. And at the time they measured in leagues, which was about 3.1 nautical miles, but by various other estimations it was less or more because it was not a scientific measure. It was actually a log measure, leaving a line behind a ship and sailing. But it was a general rule of thumb how far things were. But what this illustration was one of the maps that Columbus used. It said, here is the Azores, Antilla, and Cipango in India, Cathay, China, and Cipango was the name that Marco Polo gave Japan. And so Columbus promoted that it would only be about 2 weeks sail on the trade winds that they knew were down south to get all the way to Japan. And so that's why he finally was supported. Juan de la Costa was his second commander, who also provided two of the ships, the Pinto and the Maria. And with the royal permission, he began to gather his forces in the city of Sevilla. At this time, this was an inland port on the Guadalquivir River, if you've been there, with active shipping out to sea. Now it's all silted up, so it's now no longer a major seaport. Then they had support from the House of Jura, a banking firm in Belgium, actually, that then helped them get supplies. Now, this was considered a great adventure and a high risk. And so they gathered the sailors, about 100 sailors of mixed nationalities. But again, Columbus was a curious character because he wasn't Portuguese or Spanish, but he was put in command of a largely Spanish crew who did not like that. And then they, in these later, let's say, romantic views of the blessing of the church and the royalty sending him off to his great adventure, he set out in August of 1492. And then he sailed down to the Canary Islands and got more supplies. There was an eruption of a volcano off of Tenerife, and they considered this a sign to continue on. And then left Gomez and the Western Canaries to go off to the unknown. And these illustrations of the time showing sea monsters and such were very much what was imagined out there, that people would go out and never come back, the usual case back then. This is actually an illustration later of the Irish St. Brendan. You see that island says the island of Brendan. That's now Ireland, and they, of course, that myth had the a great whale picked up the ship, and they had a mass service on the back of the whale itself. Well, Columbus didn't have that fate. He went out and went south after the Canaries and due west on the trade winds and the currents. And again, they had only a dead reckoning of how far the longitude was, so that just by the leeway and the currents, they added about 9 miles for every 100 sea miles on their way. So they were out there. They had occasional diversions for what they thought they sighted things, but they just continued on. Of course, this is the flagship in reproduction, the Santa Maria. And this is all the story that you've known since you were a kid of the 3 little ships making their way. Occasionally, the crew demanded to go back because they felt this was a hopeless journey. And at one point, Columbus nailed a gold coin, a maravilla it's called, onto the mast, said, "Whoever sights land gets this coin." And this was very small vessels. I mean, they were no larger on deck than this room, and packed with people, and they had supplies which quickly were consumed or went bad. They were catching birds. But every morning they would sing this hymn called Salve Maria, which in Latin goes, "Savior Queen, hail, O Queen, Mother of Mercy, hail our life, our sweetness, our hope." And so that tried to encourage the crew along. And then over a month out, they started to see seabirds. And so they felt they were finally getting somewhere. Well, their track has been discussed by historians ever since, because what their log kept was probably not where they actually were. So they left Gomez, Canary Islands. Day by day, they worked their way. They thought they sighted land about here. They went north to see. They saw nothing, so they went back to the southwest. And then they finally came to one of the islands in the outer Bahama chain. And it's not known for sure which one, because their log is inaccurate, and then there's no archaeological evidence. But this is the logbook of the expedition, which has right here, allá tierra, they sighted land. And it was actually Columbus's a young servant called Ariano who sighted it. And then he, let's say, was the first European to sight any of the land in the New World. But of course, that's much disputed by various other Norse and other possible people who came to one part or the other. But nonetheless, this was, of course, put into the historical record that Columbus and his crew were the first ones to discover the Americas for Europe, though he always thought it was still Asia. And the islands look like this. They're low, they're reefs offshore. It's hard to tell it from their logbooks of what it was, but they did describe a white cliff. And this has a feature of many of the outer Bahamas. So it's been variously claimed he was in all of these different places. Of course, every little island wants to have this claim, but now it's considered probably he was on what's Watling Island or Samana Key. And so there's some different books. Samuel Morrison wrote the definitive history almost a century ago. And then a lot of Spanish books, of course. But recently, a historian named Ruth Walper has tried to scientifically identify exactly where they might have landed. Well, wherever they landed, they ran into the small settlements of the Arawak peoples. So in these, again, sort of symbolic pictures, here they are, the Arawak giving gifts to Columbus, who returns the favor by putting in a cross and claiming the land for the King of Spain. And it may have very well been Watling Island, but then from there the course gets more complicated. They land and they go around, they continue to circle around, find more islands, and they were looking for a big piece of land, of course. All they found were the Bahamas, which are one sand spit after another, and a bit of scrub brush, a few people, but certainly it didn't look like Japan or the fabled cities of Asia. Though it was even more mysterious, perhaps, particularly in retrospect. Here's a famous illustration of Columbus in his full robe with his astrolabe in hand, being greeted by a native woman in the hammock. Meanwhile, she says in that famous line, "Hey sailor, are you new in town?" And then she invited him for dinner, like she did the last guy who was on the beach there. You can see, but anyway, this is all imagination, except that he later ran into Caribe people in other parts of the Caribbean who forcibly resisted, fought back whenever they would land. Well, then his ships went down and came across of course, the greater island of Cuba, and then kept finding more bays, more islands. They came over to what's Hispaniola, now Haiti, Dominican Republic. And again, his journals say they're good harbors, or we saw more people, or we continued on and found better places where he was thinking of making a settlement. Now, his contract with the crown of Spain was that he would be called the Admiral of the Lord of the Seas and the Ocean, and have right to 10% of all he found, and then his family would be able to be governors of any lands that he claimed in the name of the crown. So he was really scouting for a settlement and looking for gold. He had found a bit of gold on some of the natives, and they kept saying, oh, there's more further along, and so that's why he kept sailing along looking for a bigger town, of which there were none. I mean, these islands had a very sparse and spread out population with no real urban concentration like would be later found in Mexico or Peru. And then he went back to Spain, back January 16th after he was in Cabo Samana, what's now Dominican Republic. Well, this became tremendous news in Europe that he got back to write about it and be lauded for his bravery and what he found of the Indies, and we still get the name Indians, the misnomer for the Native Americans to this day. But these journals were published in many languages, and suddenly all of Europe thought that he was the sensation of the age, and he was taken back to the court of Ferdinand and Isabella and made a grandee and a don, a duke of the empire. And in this case, he was allowed to sit at the royal dais there with Ferdinand and Isabella. He also brought back a couple of Native Americans. You can see this later painting just to show the European court these people that he thought were from Asia, of course. And at this point, he didn't have a real conflict with them, and he wrote about them in his journal that the Native Americans should be good servants, and they are very intelligent, for I observed they quickly took in what was indicated to them. But they're timid, and but they're good to be ordered about to work or to sow and do all that may be necessary. There are no better or gentler people in the world. Now that's ironic because of the continuing history of what was done with them. But meanwhile, back in Spain, he was given this crest of arms with the Castle of Castilla and the Lion of Leon, and then his island empire and his nautical symbol. So suddenly he was a grand knight of the empire. Meanwhile, his second-in-command, Jose de la Costa, made the first map of the Caribbean here in 1500, which shows islands and Cuba, but actually no mainland, because it was not until the second, third, and fourth trip that Columbus and then a whole fleet of more Spaniards and followed by other Europeans later found all of the coastlines of the Caribbean and North and South America. Columbus himself on his fourth voyage went down to the coast right near where we are, third voyage. The fourth voyage he went down to Panama, and so he developed the places where the Spanish Empire would finally have its headquarters, which was Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. And if you've been there, that's the oldest city in the Americas. Havana was founded a bit later. But because he came and went and brought more and more people, that led to the great incursion upon the Americas. And while he thought he was going for trade, others came to settle and to begin the rapacious search for gold above all, which he himself said drove the Europeans crazy. And so more and more Spanish particularly came and settled in Dominican Republic, the island of Hispaniola, and Cuba, and they started arguing over who got the land. They were fighting, actively decimating the natives, and when Columbus objected, he was arrested by a new governor that was sent from Spain, put in chains and sent back. This was after his third voyage, and so that was the time when he wrote his memoir. So had he not been caught up in the political upheaval of the new colony, he might not have had the time to, let's say, think about it and write what he left for us. When his, let's say, his status was restored, they gave him the greatest ship of all, called the Santissima Trinity, the Holy Trinity. This is a reproduction of that I found in the port of Malaga, Spain, a number of years ago, but it's not a sail ship, it's a museum and a restaurant. But anyway, as more people came, they started to realize all these different islands, all these different coasts. It was so vast that it led to a lot of poor Spaniards going over there. They gathered what they could to go, and Columbus was sort of the grand man of the era, and he himself profited by a lot of this, even though he had political disputes. But in his memoirs that he wrote in his later years, he kept signing his name SAS in a kind of almost a code, which this is a kind of Greek mixed with a few Latin letters, and so it can variously mean, if you take it as Greek, it means the servant of Christ. But there have been some who have proposed that actually Columbus was originally Jewish, and he was driven out of Constantinople, his family, where they ended up in Chios, and that he then, by the time he got to Spain and Portugal with the Inquisition, he was a converso, meaning he was a nominal Catholic, but some have said his real motive was to go and find a new homeland for the Jews somewhere, because they were being so persecuted from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. And so this has been said that there's sort of a coded word in Hebrew within this signature, meaning I am a servant of the Lord in the Hebrew sense. Well, nonetheless, he was still vaunted as one of the great explorers and leaders of the nation and European knowledge of this whole area. This is Ruth Wolper, who's a historian based in the Bahamas, who tried to identify the actual landing, and she built a museum of the New World there, and then invited the contemporary descendants of Columbus to come over for the opening of her museum back in the 1960s. This is Don Carlos of Colón, the longtime descendant of Columbus himself, getting the plaque at the opening of the museum. But the ongoing history is sort of tragic. And many people would blame Columbus for being the first invader. Someone was saying that the Columbus Day has now been replaced by Indigenous Peoples Day in some places that have that political correctness. But here's a later illustration of Columbus. It said about the New World, a la espada y compass más y más y más. With the sword and the compass, they'll get more and more and more, which is, of course, what the Spanish did. Cortez went to Mexico, Pizarro went to Peru, and they ravaged the local cultures and stole everything they could and subjected the people to utter slavery. First starting right in Hispaniola under the original Columbus rule, where they enslaved the Indians. If they didn't cooperate, they would consider them savages and kill them. So they worked many of them to death, to the point where a lot of them fled or died of disease. It's estimated that on that island alone there were probably 250,000 native Arawak people, but within 2 generations they were down to only 2 villages left. Most died from disease or overworking of them. And this was a pattern that was continued all around the Caribbean and then into the mainland, with the conquistadores coming in, what they call the hidalgos, which in Spanish means the son of somebody, or in other words, somebody without any title, just a farmer, fisherman, whatever, could sign on an expedition. And the Crown actively promoted this, saying they would give you free passage and a armament and supplies, so that you could go out and find more land and colonize. It's sort of like a homesteading act that would then encourage wave after wave of young Spanish men to go out there and do their worst with people. And they describe torture and murder was almost as fun as rape. But here's the death of a Caribe king called, chieftain called Hatue, who on the island of Cuba back in the early 1500s, he was tortured and then was, what they used to do was they'd read what they call the requisition, which was either you convert to Christianity and swear allegiance to the crown, otherwise we will have our way with you. And so Hatue, who spoke enough Spanish at this time, asked the priest, if I convert, will I go to heaven? And the priest said, of course. And then Hatue said, well, are there any Spaniards in heaven? And the priest said, well, only the good ones go there. To which point the chief said, I've never met a good Spaniard and I don't want to go there. And they killed him and they burned him alive and drew and quartered him. Well, anyway, this was so terrible at the time that a young Catholic priest named Bartolomé de las Casas was reading his scripture and felt that this was such great injustice that he wrote a complaint back to the church and the crown called A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies. It's in the Latin title, which was again a shocking document about all of the abuses of the native people. And the church and the crown then tried to stop this by telling the settlers that they had to treat the natives as with some human rights, but of course they just ignored it because there was too much to gain by it. This is a statue in the Dominican Republic about the last of the people who were so enslaved and abused. And of course this is an issue that goes on to this day with the native peoples all through, even in the Amazon, and resisting the incursion of other people. So you may have seen this, actually, a t-shirt, Homeland Security, Fighting Terrorism Since 1492. Well, meanwhile, Columbus thought he had done the right thing, and in the way he's been accused of crimes that he himself did not commit. He was a creature of his own period and a man of considerable courage and abilities, but when he came back after the fourth voyage, he was quite debilitated, too much time in the tropics, and he died in 1506 in Spain. And but he was famous, and so he was given a tomb in a monastery in Seville. But then the family title went to his son Diego, and then the family later asked that his remains be sent to the Dominican Republic so he could be in the cathedral in the New World that was their claim. And so what happened was that he was disinterred and sent back there, and then in recent decades in the Dominican Republic under Balaguer, the former president there, they built a new tomb for Columbus, which is a fantastic, what they call the Faro de Colón, the Lighthouse of Columbus, which is this modernistic block built in the shape of a cross with commemorations of him and all of his achievements down through it. And it's designed by an English architect, curiously. But this was a massive project just to sort of celebrate the heritage of Columbus, and they built him a new, very fancy tomb in the middle of it. But the Dominican Republic and the Spanish government have been in a dispute of where the body is. Is it still in Spain or is it here? And they refused to open either tomb to have any testing. So who knows? Maybe Columbus went for a sail. But this great monument to him in the Dominican Republic, every evening they light up this light show with the guiding cross reflected in the sky. And it's much resented in the city there because whenever they light that up, they usually have a blackout, and for an hour or so there's no electricity in the town. But that's progress for you. Well, anyway, the image of Columbus goes on in history as the great explorer and the leader of the melding of the cultures of the Atlantic. But some people said it was at the genocide of the Native Americans, the enslavement of the Africans, and to the glory and wealth of Europe. But nonetheless, in all the countries of the Americas, Columbus is, of course, famous, though the only country named after him is Colombia in South America. And some Spanish have complained that Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian, his name was put on all of the Americas instead of it all being Colombia. But nonetheless, the name goes on, and all these expositions and brands and things that are in his name. Even the little ships have been reproduced many times here, there at the Columbia Exposition in Chicago in the 1890s. The Knights of Columbus, the Catholic fraternal organization, monuments everywhere, and even avenues named after him. But and even my alma mater at Columbia University named after him. But and now you'll see in a lot of different ports knockoffs of the original little ships. You can take a ride on them. But various people, of course, complain that he was just one of many others, whether there were Vikings who came over, Egyptians who made it, Phoenicians who came over, Polynesians who were all before it. So as archaeology and human studies go on, it'll be rounded out. So again, some of these Columbus Day celebrations, which are led by the Spanish and Italians, are often have a token nod to the other explorers, or particularly to the Native Americans. So this is a ship, again, I saw a couple of years ago in Puerto Rico, a Spanish galleon that was built to be part of the great tour of the Spanish Empire, now that things are more peaceful, let's say, from Spain, and relations are good with the Hispanic Latin America. So this is a period reproduction that came in with, again, the Virgin Mary on the stern. So this heritage is very real and very important, even if Columbus himself is still, we wonder really who he was. And but meanwhile, here's a statue of him right in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and he is proud as he always was, I suppose. And then there's another one, and if you've ever been to Barcelona, there's this great tower to him right there on the front square. And then he's pointing, but he's pointing east. It's the wrong way. But nonetheless, he's a great man, and we follow in his wake, even if we don't take so much trouble with him. Well, this is one of the ships I work on. I put up this saying from Horace, which is Salam non animan butat cantanzit mare currunt, which means those who travel across the sea in a hurry cannot change their spirit. And that's a good motto for us. We take our time at sea so we can appreciate where we are, where we're going, and who we are. With that, thank you very much, and onward with our explorations. Those who go too far only those who go too far can know how far one can go. Thank you very much.